I was waiting until I had a big monitor and a good graphics card. I ended up waiting longer than expected. At last, the Metro franchise has departed Moscow entirely, as well as the timeline of the novels thus far. The opening hour of the game is the speedrun of the arc of the Metro 2035 novel, where Artyom discovers that the remnants of the government, expressing its will through the Hansa, have deliberately isolated Moscow from the rest of the world, which perhaps hasn't been bombed out that badly, out of fear that the war is still on and they might be located and bombed again. And then, with Anna, he leaves Moscow behind to find new horizons. However, while the broad strokes of the plot may seem similar, the actual story couldn't be more different, even in this vestigial form. And this is where I start to take issue with this game's storytelling. Of course, one couldn't expect a big video game to be as bleak as Metro 2035 was, which starts on a downer note and descends to depths which require a midget submarine. But let's look at the character of Colonel Miller, the gruff leader of the Spartan Order. In the book, he is a crippled shell of a man and one of the hardcore paranoiacs, an enthusiastic supporter of the plan to isolate Moscow and absolutely unrepentant. In Exodus, Miller was apparently only read in on this whole radio jammer thing the day before yesterday, and the moment the jig is up, he's bantering and ready to throw it all away and ride off into the wilderness. Doesn't even need to pack a suitcase. He wasn't committed to this whole isolation idea, and that was the idea of the bad Siloviki, not him. Miller is obsessed with the idea that the NATO forces have actually occupied the rest of the country and the crew will run into them at any moment. But that's played for comedy more than anything, with the country so obviously being empty of anything other than failed Homo Sovieticus and suspiciously well-fed mutants. When this arc essentially ends with a funhouse shooting gallery sequence with hundreds of screaming cannibals, it's a little hard to take seriously as a character arc, even when it's contrived to have a more salient consequence later on. This isn't to say the game is a total dead end for storytelling and themes, it's just that it comes out in the world building and in the environment as opposed to in the big plot. Much of Glukhovsky's cynicism and political dark humor is still visible here. If I was going to list highlight moments from the entire franchise thus far, the trip to another metro in Novosibirsk would have to be on it. You crack open another metro system thousands of kilometers from Moscow and it's just another execution pit of corpses, under an unknown but all too familiar flag. As above as below, the same fate seems to meet humanity no matter where they get packed beneath the earth. If anything, I think the game is too on the nose with its themes. A bunch of lost boys in the woods struggling to understand the practical instructions and intellectual legacy left to them by their teachers? I wonder why this big old statue of Vlad Lenin is here. I'm sure many Americans might miss the reference, and I'm sure this big dry ocean of tribals enslaved by oil barons is mostly here because of Fury Road, but this really feels like it's meant to evoke the Aral Sea. And of course, we can draw our own conclusions on what the isolationist, paranoid leadership of the Moscow Metro is meant to be in reference to. What definitely has changed is the tone of presentation, the darkness. I don't mean the literal darkness, although the nights in this game are just pathetically bright. On my system, it's what seemed like reasonable gamma settings. The only way to tell it was nighttime was because the enemies had headlamps on. I'm really talking about something more figurative. Metro 2033 in particular had an oppressive sense that all you were ever doing was delaying the inevitable. Have you ever thought about the implications of breaking a light bulb to maintain stealth in that game? I doubt Polis has a good light bulb factory. Every military-grade round you fire, every life you take, everything you break, the Metro slides slightly closer to the abyss. Exodus loses something by being set out on the wide wastes of Russia, where we couldn't be further from the brink. These are dangerous lands, sure, and scavenge is still necessary to survive, but there's plenty to eat, and more ammunition is always a single crafting menu away. One of my bigger mechanical gripes with the game is that the new Tihar feels like a phased plasma rifle in the 40-watt range with ammunition which is basically free. I'm sure it's different when it's harder to aim on consoles, but it feels like it makes every other suppressed weapon irrelevant, and you'll be flush with every other kind of ammunition when you're just headshotting mutants with it. The gun might get dirty, but you clean it with chemicals that literally grow on trees. I'm not saying that every piece of post-apocalyptic media needs to be a total downer about the irreparability of complex civilization that ends with everyone starving to death. But I feel like Exodus unavoidably lost some of its unique charm by moving to a living, above-ground setting. And it's a shame as the few underground environments feel like some of the strongest in the entire series. Take the satellite center you explore in the middle of the Caspian section of the game. A military bunker slowly being reclaimed by the Earth and utterly infested with the giant spiders. It's quite eerie when your friends power up the base's generators, web-coded fluorescent lights clicking on, and the evacuation alerts from decades past start playing over the PA. Everything in the base left exactly as it was with the skeletons of its suffocated occupants. And it's a fantastic moment when the generators start to fail and the lights progressively click off, rooms becoming oceans of scuttling death. Too bad the Tihar also has a special ammo which instantly deletes the creepy crawlies. Perhaps it's less the fact that the areas are underground, but that they are tightly designed set pieces. The final mission sees you explore a singularly haunted hospital in an irradiated Novosibirsk, under the baleful light of an anomaly you can't quite get a look at, hunted by massive blind mutants. It's an extremely tense mission that also made a good impression on me, evoking the best of the Moscow Library and other similarly eldritch locations. And it also saw the return of environmental stealth mechanics, having to be wary of stepping in broken glass or anything else that could make a noise. The stealth mechanics being simple and easy through most of the game start to pry at one of my major issues with it. Stealthing through the major areas in Metro 2033 could be really frustrating, because it was somewhat realistic and every tiny bit of light or sound Artyom made would draw attention. In Exodus, it feels like just about every other first-person stealth game. As long as you crouch walk and stick to the shadows, nobody will ever see you coming. Now, this is merciful, since Exodus throws a lot more highly recommended stealth sequences at you. But the fiddly old stealth mechanics had the virtue of really making you pay attention to the world around you and what little Artie was doing with his hands. I still remember the layout of the first room you can sneak through in 2033, and the location of the first patch of broken glass I stepped in like an idiot. Moving beyond the Moscow Metro was incredibly ambitious for the game, but it feels like something was left behind. Figuratively speaking, we left behind the bespoke environments teeming with detail and humanity. Literally speaking, we left the Metro, and the people within, behind. At the end of 2035, Artyom leaves the Metro behind with Anna because he believes it to be beyond saving, which is probably true. In Exodus, Artyom and company strike out into the wastes because they want to make a new home above ground, but there's nary a mention of what they will do to help the people of Moscow. The bad governance of the Metro means leaving all those people to the no solace, I guess. Feature-wise, the sections where you get to roam the Aurora replace the sections of the previous games where you got to roam populated stations. And from a certain perspective, these sections are much more technically impressive and feature a lot more dialogue and jamming on the guitar. But from the earliest trailers of the game, I felt there was a substantial shift in tone and direction here. We've moved from a story that focused on a world and populations to a story about family in the loosest sense. This is not about the perseverance of the people of the Metro, but about how badass Artyom and his Order comrades are. I can't really criticize a piece of media for trying to go in a more character-centric direction, but as they have been in previous games, the lack of agency and things to do for most of the cast means they remain thin outlines like the American, the horny, the Kazakh, etc., even though they receive large amounts of dialogue. Metro Exodus might be an exodus from all that has been established in the Metro franchise thus far, and I think it is for the most part weaker for it. But at the same time, after Last Light, I don't know what they could have done other than rehash the formula of the previous games, which would not have been particularly interesting. Making a straight adaptation of Metro 2035 was just flat out not an option for a variety of reasons. It sounds like this direction was driven almost entirely by game design concerns, with Glukhovsky's work having limited influence on the proceedings. And I wonder if there are any Russian language sources that would be illuminating on this front. I'm not really sure what consensus is on this game now, years later, so let me know in the comments. Have a good night.